1.4.2. Designing the flow. Flows are the primary mechanism for building integration applications with Mule. A flow consists of a source of data followed by a series of message processors. A message begins its life from an inbound endpoint, which could be an HTTP post or the scheduled polling of a database table, and is processed by the subsequent processors in the flow in the order in which they are defined. Flows support multiple invocation styles as defined by their exchange pattern. A one-way exchange pattern typically means the flow is asynchronous, for instance. The request-response exchange pattern means the flow will return a result. A flow can optionally end with an outbound endpoint, which sends the message to another flow or server. The palette on the right-hand side of the screen contains the library of endpoints and message processors you'll use to build your flows. Use the filter search box to find the HTTP endpoint and drag it into your flow. Your screen should now look something like Figure 1.7. Figure 1.7. Dragging the HTTP inbound endpoint to the flow. The vertical orientation of the HTTP endpoint indicates that the flow's exchange pattern is request-response. Exchange patterns indicate if a flow returns a result or not. Let's configure the flow's exchange pattern to one-way, along with the host, port, and path the HTTP server will be listening on. You can do this by right-clicking on the HTTP endpoint, which will show you something that looks like Figure 1.8. Figure 1.8. Configuring the HTTP endpoint's properties. You now need to add two more message processors to this flow, the byte array to string transformer and the JMS outbound endpoint. The byte array to string transformer is needed to transform the HTTP inbound endpoint's default payload type, a stream of bytes, to an instance of a string. You'll once again drag these from the library of processors on the right into your flow, leaving you with something that looks like Figure 1.9. Figure 1.9. Adding the byte array to string transformer and JMS outbound endpoint to the flow. Now right-click on the JMS endpoint and define the queue to dispatch to, Figure 1.10. Figure 1.10. Configuring the JMS endpoint's properties. You might notice that the JMS endpoint has a red X on it. This is because you haven't configured a JMS broker for it to connect to. Let's configure it to use an instance of ActiveMQ, an Apache-licensed, open-source messaging broker that supports JMS, running on localhost. You'll install ActiveMQ in a second. To do this, you'll need to right-click on the endpoint, select the References tab and click on the plus icon, as illustrated in Figures 1.11 and 1.12. You need to change the JMS spec to 1.1. Figure 1.11. Configuring the JMS connector. Figure 1.12. Configuring the ActiveMQ connector. Now let's set up a local ActiveMQ instance that you can use to test with. Download ActiveMQ, activemq.apache.org web link. We tested with version 5.5.1, uncompress the file, navigate into the bin directory, and then run ActiveMQ start. Let's take a step back and consider what you've done. Products will be posted to the HTTP endpoint as JSON. The byte array to string transformer converts the raw bytes of the HTTP post to a string. We'll discuss transformers in depth in Chapter 4. The JMS outbound endpoint then finally dispatches the string to the specified JMS queue. Endpoints are Mule's mechanism for getting data into and out of flows. We'll discuss both in detail in Chapter 3.